They changed the paintings, but they couldn't change the story.
Before you start clutching your Bible, sit down and give me 11 seconds. Moses was black. The man who parted the Red Sea around 1446 BC, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, who stood on Mount Sinai and came down with the 10 Commandments, was a dark-skinned African Hebrew, born in Egypt to 2 Levite parents named Amram and Jochebed. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace and looked so much like an Egyptian that the daughters of the priest of Midian called him an Egyptian when they met him at a well, recorded in Exodus chapter 2, verse 19. He married a Kushite woman named Zipporah, mentioned in Numbers chapter 12, verse 1, and Cush is the ancient name for Ethiopia and Sudan. His own sister Miriam got struck with leprosy by God in Numbers 12, specifically because she talked down on Moses for marrying a black woman, which makes no sense unless Moses himself was already part of that same African world. The Hebrew word for Moses, Moshe, comes from an Egyptian root meaning son or born of, the same root in pharaoh names like Thutmose and Ramose. Stay with me, because the geography is documented, the genealogy is in the text, and the European painters lied with a paintbrush for 1,000 years. Open Exodus chapter 2 and walk through it slowly. Moses is born around 1526 BC by traditional dating, during a time when Pharaoh has ordered every Hebrew male baby thrown into the Nile. His mother Jochebed hides him for 3 months, then puts him in a basket of bulrushes sealed with pitch and floats him in the river. Pharaoh's daughter finds him while bathing, opens the basket, and the text says in verse 6 that she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Stop right there. She identified him as Hebrew at a glance. Now, if Moses had looked dramatically different from the Egyptian babies of the palace, that recognition makes sense only one way. But it doesn't go the way European art tells you. The Egyptians of the New Kingdom period painted themselves on their own tomb walls with deep reddish-brown skin. The Nubians to their south were painted with even darker brown and black skin. The Hebrews living among them in Goshen for 400 years would have looked similar enough that the difference Pharaoh's daughter clocked was cultural and tribal, not a dramatic skin color contrast between brown and white. Moses looked like the Egyptian babies because both groups were brown-skinned Afro-Asiatic peoples. The recognition was about clothing, swaddling, the basket itself, maybe a circumcision mark, not a pale baby standing out in a brown nursery. Now go to the well in Midian, because this is the moment that locks the case shut. Moses, grown, has killed an Egyptian taskmaster who was beating a Hebrew and has fled east into the Sinai Peninsula. He sits down at a well in Midian, which sits in modern northwest Saudi Arabia near the Sinai border. The 7 daughters of the priest of Midian come to water their flocks. Some shepherds drive them away. Moses stands up, fights off the shepherds, and waters the flocks for the women. The women go home to their father, a man named Reuel, also called Jethro. Their father asks how they got home so quickly. They answer in Exodus chapter 2, verse 19, An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds. They called him an Egyptian, not a Hebrew, not a foreigner from far away, an Egyptian. These are Midianite women, themselves Semitic, themselves dark, themselves part of the African-Arabian world. They looked at Moses and clocked him as an Egyptian. You don't mistake somebody's nationality unless they look like that nationality. Moses looked like an Egyptian because Egyptians and Hebrews and Midianites all look like the African continent that birthed them. Drop into Numbers chapter 12 because this is where the family fight tells you everything. Moses, by this point, has led the Hebrews out of Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, received the law on Mount Sinai, and is leading the people through the wilderness. His sister Miriam and his brother Aaron come at him with a complaint. Verse 1 says, "And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman." The Hebrew word translated Ethiopian here is Kushite, referring to a woman from Kush, the kingdom south of Egypt covering modern Sudan and Ethiopia. Some scholars try to argue this Kushite wife is the same as Zipporah, his Midianite wife. Others argue it's a second wife from deeper in Africa. Either way, Moses married a black woman, and his siblings tried to shame him for it. God's response in verse 9 is wrath. He strikes Miriam with leprosy, turns her skin white as snow, and makes her stand outside the camp for 7 days. Read that punishment carefully. The sister who looked down on a black woman gets her own skin bleached white as a curse. The symbolism is brutal and deliberate. God himself defended the black woman Moses chose and humbled the sister who had a problem with it. Now look at the geography of the whole Exodus story, because the map has been hiding the answer for thousands of years. The Hebrews lived in Egypt for 430 years, according to Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, settled in the region of Goshen in the eastern Nile Delta. 430 years is 15 to 20 generations. They came in as a small family group of around 70 people under Jacob in Genesis 46, and they came out as a nation of over 600,000 fighting men plus women and children, possibly 2 million people total. That growth happened entirely on African soil. Those generations were born under the African sun, married within and around the African and Semitic populations of the Delta, ate African food, drank African water, worked African land, and developed under African skies. Whatever genetic and cultural starting point Jacob's family had when they entered Egypt, 400 years of African life shaped what came out. The nation that walked out of Egypt at the Exodus was an African-born, African-shaped, African-looking people led by an African-born, African-shaped, African-looking prophet. Sit with Moses' lineage because the family tree is on the page. Moses' father Amram was a Levite, son of Kohath, grandson of Levi. Moses' mother Jochebed was also a Levite, the daughter of Levi himself, according to Numbers chapter 26, verse 59, born to Levi in Egypt. So both of Moses' parents came from the same African-born Levite line. Levi was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, but Jacob himself was the grandson of Abraham, who came out of Ur of the Chaldees in southern Mesopotamia, where the ancient populations were dark-skinned Semitic peoples closely related to the Kushites and Egyptians. Abraham's wife Sarah was Semitic. His concubine, Hagar, was Egyptian, so Ishmael was half African by birth. Abraham's son Isaac married Rebekah from the Aramean line in northern Mesopotamia. Isaac's son Jacob married Leah and Rachel, daughters of Laban the Aramean. The Arameans of that period were dark-skinned Semitic peoples, not pale Europeans. The line that runs from Abraham to Moses is a line of dark-skinned ancient Near Eastern peoples whose racial reality matches the African and Middle Eastern world they lived in, not the European world that later painted them. Drop into the meaning of Moses' name, because even the linguistics testify. The name Moshe in Hebrew is explained in Exodus 2:10 as meaning drawn out, because Pharaoh's daughter drew him out of the water. But the deeper etymology of the name traces to the Egyptian root mos or maize, meaning son or born of, the same root that gives you pharaoh names like Thutmose, son of Thoth, Amos, son of Ea, and Ramosi, son of Ra. Moses' name is structurally an Egyptian name. Pharaoh's daughter named him with an Egyptian word because she raised him as an Egyptian prince. The text of Exodus and Acts both confirm he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Acts chapter 7 verse 22 says, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds. He spoke Egyptian. He read hieroglyphs. He knew Egyptian religion, Egyptian science, Egyptian military strategy, Egyptian law. For the first 40 years of his life, he was an African prince in everything but birth identity. And even his birth identity was African because his parents had been African born for 4 generations. Now look at how the Egyptians painted themselves, because the visual receipts are still on the tomb walls. Egyptian tomb paintings from the New Kingdom period, which is exactly when most scholars place the Exodus story, show Egyptians with deep reddish-brown skin, tightly curled or braided hair, full lips, and broad noses. Nubians to the south, who lived in close cultural and military contact with Egypt, were painted with even darker skin. The Asiatic peoples to the east, which would include the Hebrews and other Semitic groups, were painted with skin tones ranging from olive brown to dark brown, often with similar features to the Egyptians. There is not a single ancient Egyptian painting of a Hebrew or any other Levantine person depicted as pale European. The visual world of the Bible's Egypt was a world of brown and black-skinned peoples. Moses walked through that world and blended in until the day he chose to walk out of it. Walk back to the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, because this is the moment his calling locks into the larger African context. Moses is tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro near Mount Horeb, also called Mount Sinai, in the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula is geographically part of Africa, a land bridge connecting Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. When God speaks to Moses out of the burning bush, he is speaking to him on African soil. The mountain where Moses will later receive the 10 Commandments sits on African soil. The entire pivotal religious encounter that births the Mosaic covenant happens in Africa. The God of the Bible chooses to reveal his name, I am that I am, to a black African Hebrew on an African mountain. That theological geography has been hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years, while painters in Florence and Antwerp painted Moses as a flowing, bearded European patriarch in a Renaissance robe. Now feel the weight of who Moses actually was in his own time. He was not a movie character. He was an 80-year-old man when he stood before Pharaoh demanding the release of his people. He had spent 40 years as an Egyptian prince, 40 years as a fugitive shepherd in the Midian desert, and was now starting his third 40-year act as a prophet and liberator. His brother Aaron was 83. The text says in Exodus 4:10 that Moses protested his calling because he was slow of speech and slow of tongue, possibly meaning he had a speech impediment or had lost fluency in Hebrew after decades in Midian speaking the local dialect. He was tired. He was scarred. He had killed a man. He had run. He had built a life in the desert with a black African wife and children. And he walked back into Egypt anyway, into the palace where he had grown up, to confront the new Pharaoh and demand the release of 2 million people. That is not a Hollywood hero. That is a real man, an African Hebrew elder, doing the hardest thing of his life, because the God who met him in the bush would not let him do anything else. Sit with the rage moment, because this part has to be said clearly. The whitewashing of Moses is one of the most consequential erasures in religious history. For over 1,000 years, European Christian art has painted Moses as a tall, pale, flowing-haired European patriarch, often with horns of light coming from his head because of a Latin mistranslation by St. Jerome around 400 AD. Michelangelo's famous Moses statue in Rome, sculpted between 1513 and 1515, depicts him as a muscular Italian elder with literal horns on his head. Charlton Heston played Moses in The Ten Commandments in 1956, a tall white American man parting a fake Red Sea on a Hollywood soundstage, and that image got burned into the global imagination for the next 70 years. Christian Bale played Moses in Exodus Gods and Kings in 2014. White actor, brown actors playing his servants. The visual whitewashing has been so consistent for so long that when black Christians today try to point out that Moses was a black African Hebrew, other black Christians push back because the European image feels more true to them than the historical reality. That is the depth of the conditioning. The lie has become the standard, and the truth has to fight to be heard. Look at what the Talmud and ancient Jewish sources actually say about Moses' appearance, because Jewish memory preserved details that European Christianity scrubbed. The Talmud and various midrashic sources describe Moses with skin like the rising sun, with thick curly hair, and with features that match the African and Middle Eastern world he lived in. The medieval Rabbi Rashi, commenting on biblical passages, preserved descriptions of Moses that bear no resemblance to the European paintings. Ancient Christian writers like Clement of Alexandria around 200 AD and African theologian writing in Egypt described Moses in terms consistent with his African upbringing. The whitening happened later, primarily in medieval and Renaissance European art, and got cemented into the global imagination through colonialism and Hollywood. The original Jewish and early Christian memory of Moses was much closer to the African Hebrew man the text actually describes. Now look at why this matters for your family right now. When black Christians grow up with an image of Moses as a pale European patriarch, the entire Exodus story becomes a story about other people that we are graciously allowed to identify with. But the Exodus is not a story about other people. It is the story of a black African Hebrew prophet leading a black African Hebrew nation out of bondage. The parallels to the black American experience are not metaphorical decoration laid on top of a foreign story. They are literal recognitions of a story that was always about a black people coming out of slavery. The spirituals that black Americans sang in the cotton fields, Go Down Moses, Let My People Go, Wade in the Water, those songs identified with Moses because black ancestors recognized themselves in him at a level deeper than what the white Sunday school teachers were telling them. They saw a black man leading black people out of bondage, and they sang their own freedom into the same melody. That recognition was correct. The pictures on the wall were the lie, not the songs in the field. Walk through the cultural inheritance Moses left because his black African Hebrew genius shaped the world. He wrote the Torah, the foundational text of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He gave the 10 Commandments, which became the ethical foundation for legal systems across half the planet. He instituted the Passover, still observed by Jews around the world over 3,000 years later. He designed the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that became the template for every synagogue, church, and Christian altar that came after. He established a priesthood through his brother Aaron that shaped religious leadership structures for millennia. He led a nation in formation for 40 years through a wilderness, giving them law, identity, and direction. A black African Hebrew man did all of that, and Western civilization spent 2,000 years thanking a fictional European version for the gift. Bring it home where it matters. The next time you see a painting of Moses with flowing white hair and pale European features, replace it in your mind with an actual man, a weathered African elder in his 80s with deep brown skin tanned darker by 40 years of desert sun, with tightly curled hair gone gray, with calloused shepherd's hands, with a black African Hebrew wife at his side and black African Hebrew children running around his tent. Picture him standing barefoot before a burning bush on an African mountain. Picture him raising his staff over the Red Sea. Picture him climbing Sinai while 2 million black African Hebrews waited at the base of the mountain. Picture him coming down with his face shining so bright with the glory of God that he had to wear a veil. That is the man the Bible describes. That is the man your ancestors recognized in the spirituals. That is the man whose face has been hidden behind a stranger's portrait for too long. Teach the kids the receipts. Moses, born around 1526 BC. Both parents Levites, both born in Egypt. Identified as Hebrew by Pharaoh's daughter at birth, raised as an Egyptian prince, called an Egyptian by Midianite women at a well, married a Kushite woman from the African kingdom of Kush, defended by God against his own sister's anti-black bias in Numbers 12, wrote the Torah, received the law on Mount Sinai in 1446 BC, led the Exodus, died at 120 years old on Mount Nebo, looking into the promised land he never entered. A black African Hebrew prophet, recognized by his own people, vindicated by God himself, and erased by paintbrushes 1,000 years after his bones turned to dust. Put his real face back where it belongs. Drop a comment with the verse that hits you hardest. Tell me if you grew up picturing Moses as a white European and how that shaped your reading of the Bible. Tell me if your grandmother ever told you the spirituals were about a black man leading a black people out of bondage. Tag a pastor whose flock needs to see this and tell me which black Hebrew figure you want me to break down next. King David, King Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, the prophet Jeremiah, Hagar, the Egyptian mother of Ishmael. Pick one and I'll bring the receipts the same way.